I'm Stuart Gillespie, and I live in a place called West Bath, Maine, and I worked for 27 years at a place called Naugatuck Community College, Naugatuck Valley Community College, and I had 37 years in education, all total, and I am here in retirement, having retired in 2002.
And if you'd like to tell us about formative years, that would be a great place to start.
Well, regarding music, I think the most influential person in my formative years was my grandmother, who was a woman we referred to as grand-mère. She was a very cultured woman. She spoke 4 languages. She was a great traveler. She always felt that I was musical and wanted me to pursue music. My parents were not so enthusiastic or encouraging because they felt that every young man should have a liberal arts education and not specialize in anything, especially music, which was no way to earn a living. So my parents were not particularly encouraging that way. Consequently, I took piano lessons, but they were for fun. And I remember having a piano teacher by the name of Mrs. Shaw, and I kind of drove her crazy because I was constantly switching things into minor keys and minor pieces that would be, and I did this in a recital, unannounced, and she thought I was kind of very undisciplined and was also not very encouraging. But then when I went to high school, I had a music teacher by the name of Mr. Ingerson, Jim Ingerson, and he taught me voice, and I very quickly developed quite a good voice. And to my parents' amazement, when we were participating with our high school group in a festival of high schools, I stood up and sang Lord Randall. My parents couldn't believe that, where did this come from? Was that they couldn't get over it. So that was really the start of my really strong interest in music. And Jim Ingerson encouraged me to go to music school, but my parents again prevailed, and I went to a liberal arts college from 1963 to 65 out west in the Midwest, a place called Parsons College in Iowa. And I majored in sociology. And in that process got smitten with the Peace Corps, and these were wild times in the 60s, and it was, long hair, free love, a lot of protesting, anti-establishment stuff. And so anyway, I got drafted in the middle of all this, having left college to go in the Peace Corps. And that was really where my music career began. I went into basic training in Fort Jackson in South Carolina, and then into advanced infantry training with the idea that I was supposed to go to Vietnam as a foot soldier. And when I was in training, a organization called the 3rd Army Chorus of Fort Benning came through, and I got permission from the commanding officer to go up and listen to the concert. It was a Saturday night. And after the concert, I approached the director, who was a Captain Bond, and I asked how one would get into an organization like this, and he said, "You audition with me, boy." And that was a huge break for me, because this was a highly disciplined, very good choral, all-men's choral group. And I sang with them for about 8 months until I was had orders cut on me to go to Europe. And I was supposed to be a tank driver in Europe. And the same thing happened again. I went to the commanding officer and told him I had a letter of recommendation to the U.S. Army Chorus Europe. and I would like to audition. And his name was a Colonel Laboda, I think. And he said, well, you're in luck, boy. If you'll be on the doorstep at 0400 hours, I'm going to Heidelberg for a general's job. And so next morning, a stretch limousine arrived with in olive drab green with 2 flags on the front marking his position as a bird colonel. And he got his job as a general, and I got into the U.S. Army Chorus Europe. And that really was the start of it. That was a top drawer group that sang all over Europe. I probably saw and sang in front of more European communities than most Europeans get to see. As we're on the road probably 3/4 of the year doing concerts, and the other 25% we were learning repertoire and rehearsal. So it was that's how I got my start. But
so after the military years, what was the next most important
next
step in your professional career?
I came out of the service, having gone to Parsons College, and made an application for the University of Connecticut, and was very pleased to see that they were willing to accept me on what they call the Fresh Start program. And I very much needed that, because my 2 years at Parsons College were not the most productive. And anyway, I actually started with a pretty good log of courses that got me through most of the core courses, and was able to go and concentrate on my music major. And I went to UConn as a music major under John Poline, who was the choral director there. And I took voice lessons, and I was pretty good. I had enough of a voice that I had some recommendation to go and try and maybe get into at least the chorus in the Metropolitan New York, and to try to do an audition there. I had a big baritone voice that had been developed through my singing with the U.S. Army Chorus, but a lot of good voice lessons. And anyway, John Poline was a big influence for me. He introduced me more to the fine choral repertoire of Palestrina and the Renaissance and lots of Bach and so on, whereas I'd had a very good introduction to more of the modern choral music through the U.S. Army Chorus. Randall Thompson's song of Testament of Freedom, which, by the way, we had to memorize from one end to the other. Words, everything, before you could get on the risers. We did a lot of American musicals. The Europeans loved to hear the American musicals. A lot of Shaw Parker arrangements of folk songs for men's choir, from Shenandoah to Dawson arrangements. I got a heavy load of very good exposure to good repertoire. And John Poline was the frosting on the cake. He was a wonderful taste in music, a very compassionate and interesting man, a good director. And he taught me choral conducting, even though I wasn't a choral conducting major. That just came along with it. But it was interesting, in the military, I came away with something that was important. We had a director in the U.S. Army Chorus who was a Juilliard piano major, and perhaps not a very good one at that. He was pretty musical, but he knew absolutely nothing about choral music. And in the U.S. military's infinite wisdom, they assigned him to this organization. And this organization had singers from, and I'll bring up this fellow Tom Simmons, for instance, from San Francisco Opera, Jim Deering, who was Roger Wagner's personal assistant and tenor in the Roger Wagner Chorale, and just 35 to 40 people of that caliber singing. And this poor director who had a military edict to develop choral music, and you did it his way without question. The interesting thing in it was that the product was astoundingly good, even though he broke every rule in the book, from the point of view of of diction, ending consonants were missing, but it just was a wonderful, wonderful sound. And the reason was it was a collective dislike for this man. And we pulled together as a group, and were so closely knit as a group that the sound was self-assured and very reliable, very high quality, excellent product. It was interesting. It was at the end of my 3-year term with them, they brought on another choral director who was a beer-drinking, buddy-buddy, back-slapping guy who had a lot of choral experience. And the group's quality fell because of that lack of the cohesiveness. We started infighting since we didn't have Antonian to fight anymore, the former director. So I learned a really interesting lesson in that Army experience that helped a lot at UConn. And then it was a early graduate recital that I took a trek down the Mystic Seaport. And with the idea that I was going to get some repertoire of old sailor songs, folk songs, to put into concert settings, because I had heard Benjamin Britten's pieces like the Boatman Song and so on and so forth, and I thought, oh, wouldn't that be neat to have some settings of my own, of sailor songs for the concert stage. And I was ushered up to this man's office. His name was Stuart Frank, and he was in charge of their education program and was their shanty singer there, and a renowned author that I didn't know much about. And he sort of heard my story and then kind of looked at me and said, you know, what are you going to go and take these wonderful pieces of folk music and alter them for the, I won't use his language, alter them for the concert stage. This is how they're supposed to be done. He grabs a concertina and he starts playing these songs and singing with them. Then he threw the concertina at me and said, now you try it. And within about 5 minutes I figured out the rhyme and reason of this little instrument. And he said, why don't you take it home for a week? And he gave me 3 or 4 books. I took them home, read about it, came back in a week, and I played him a few songs, and he said, wouldn't you like to work for us? And so that started my lifelong interest in music of the sea and its history, maritime history, but also the demise of my voice. It really was ruinous to my voice, singing outdoors, singing in a way that kind of replicated the sound of sailors when they were singing on ships. Because, you know, if you go back into the archives of the Smithsonian, you can hear recordings of sailors in the turn of the century singing, and they had a very strange kind of way of singing, kind of nasal, throaty combination of very harsh sound, and doing that outdoors, giving presentations without microphones to a large group of people in the outdoors with wind and so on. It wasn't long before I had real vocal problems, and to this day I suffer from those. So anyway, but now I have a double-edged sword here. I am a teacher, having graduated from UConn with an interest in choral, a strong interest in choral music, and a strong interest in folk music, and trekking down to Mystic Seaport in the summers to be their shanty man, which I did for 12 years.
Wow.
Even at Naugatuck Valley, I was going from Waterbury all the way to Mystic on a daily commute. And so anyway.
Is that when you knew choral conducting was going to be your life?
I knew choral conducting was going to be my life when I stood on the stage with John Pauline, and he was grabbing your hand, and you're flailing along, and wow, gee, they even follow you, and you do this, and they stop. It's kind of it's a kind of thrilling moment when, at the turn of a hand, everybody does what you say. So anyway, yes, it was in undergraduate school and then into graduate school that I knew I wanted to do that. And I got hired right out of grad school at Ram High School. And that's when I became entrenched. And shortly after that, became involved with the Manchester Symphony Chorale. And I did that for also 12 years. And that's when I really started to have this fervent love for choral music, and did a lot of it.
And if you had to choose either a piece of music or a genre of music that you would say is really your bread and butter?
I like the tonal, modern classics, such as Randall Thompson's Testament of Freedom, Andrew Carter's Benedici Te, a lot of the Benjamin Britten. I like Poulenc's music. I really favor that. The great classics, the B minor Mass and the Mozart Requiem, I've done them enough in my life where I don't want to say they're old, but I much prefer the more modern pieces. And that's what I like the best.
And when did you start composing?
When I've always played around with making up music, I guess is a good way to put it. And back to my grandmother, grand-mère, Eleanor Parker was her name. I used to make up songs for her, and I think that's one of the reasons she felt that I should go to Juilliard, which didn't happen, but nevertheless, she thought I was really gifted. And trying to think of the famous person with whom she was very friendly. He was a television celebrity on, I'm going to draw a blank here. At any rate, I played for him, and she used to love to show me off. And anyway, so I did not write music, though, until I was at Naugatuck Valley, because I didn't have the tools.
And that was what year?
1978, 79, 80, in there. Mm-hmm. And that happened. I had a wonderful mentor by the name of David Judson, who was a friend of my family's. Mr. and Mrs. Judson, as they were always known to us, had 3 kids, and they were our age, and my dad had a sailboat, and they had a sailboat. So weekends, we would go down to the shore, and we'd get on our sailboats, and we'd go off sailing as families. And David ran a ski area called Otis Ridge, which you may know of, in Otis, Massachusetts. And I taught skiing for him. And that was a deal where I had to go and live at the ski area, and frequently in the evening we would get together because we were family friends, and he presented me with this little ragtag book of A.E. Housman's poetry. And he said, someday you might like to play some guitar with this, or make up some music to this. And I fooled around with a number of the poems, like the one, when I was 1 in 20, I heard a wise man say. I tried to do that with guitar and make up my own melody. But it was in 1978-79 that I decided to try a choral piece based on that poem. And it stuck. It got published. It was the first thing I ever wrote. And I've since been dedicated all those Shropshire lads to David Judson. And anyway.
I have a question for you about your first music room at Naugatuck Valley. I'm reminded of the description you gave me when I first started teaching there.
Yeah. Well, Naugatuck Valley was then Mattituck Community
Yes.
College. And we were an operation that was in a bowling alley. Half the campus was downtown in a bowling alley. The other part of the campus was in Quonset huts that had been put as storage areas for Waterbury Technical School. And that's where they stored all their machinery and stuff. Well, when Mattituck started getting along, and also they had classrooms in Kennedy High School. We had 3 locations, and this was kind of a little commuter school, and there were 500 or 600 students in 1974 or 5 it started. And I arrived in 76 or 77, and they assigned me to one of those Quonset huts, and I had a Yamaha piano and a record player, and in that Quonset hut. And then and Joseph Sestouli was the new division director at that time. He wasn't the dean, he was the division director, and he hired me as the division director. And he showed me all around campus and said, this big foundation he was showing me, and he brought out all the line drawings, the architectural line drawings, is going to be this someday, and there is a fine arts center in there. And so it was with great hope and enthusiasm that I went into this program with the idea that one day we were going to have a fine arts center. And of course, you know, in El Grasso in the 80s, capped it off, never to be built. And it took a lot of doing, mostly on the part of Tim Upson, who was our local senator at the time, and consequently also a singer in the Naugatuck Valley Chorus. His influence, mostly his influence among others, to get that permanent cap taken off the foundation and get a modified version of the original version of that building built. And it was fun to grow with that place, I'll tell you, from Quonset hut to what we have.
What was your fondest memory of Naugatuck Valley, either with students or colleagues or any experience you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think the most profound experience for me at Naugatuck Valley, but it was in a larger sense with the American Choral Directors Association. To my complete surprise, they awarded me in 1997 the Choral Conductor Year of the Conductor of the Year award. And we had the Naugatuck Valley Choir on stage. I think they may have even known about it, and I didn't. And Scott Campbell came forward and presented, and I was just speechless.
Can you tell us anything about the students?
Well, they were interesting mixed bag. We had students and I should qualify this, we had 2 types of student at the college. One was the regular student for academic credit. And these students, many of them were what I would call general liberal arts majors, required to take music during the semester as part of their fine arts fulfillment. And that was one of the, I think, great things about Naugatuck Valley, that every student was required to take one fine arts, whether you were an automotive mechanic major or you were a nursing major, you had to take a fine arts before you graduated. And so we had a real mixed bag of students, all of whom were very enthusiastic about taking, for instance, choir. Most of them found out about choir from having taken music appreciation. That's where they sort of got into it. Then we had the students that were called the continuing education students. And they were students who came into the college for a more, I want to call it, disciplined approach to a choral experience, and some would audit classes, music appreciation. A number of students who were continuing ed students who would take music appreciation or theory classes just for interest. So there was a wonderful amalgamation of seasoned citizens who had been out in the working field, knew what it took to be successful, and then our younger students who were mixing it in with them. And I really feel that cross-pollination was very healthy for both. It was probably an eye-opener for the older generation to see how the younger generation sort of worked and thought and believed in, and then for the younger generation to listen to the older generation. So in the 85 or 90 that we had in the choral group, there was about a 60-40 split. 60 community participation, all of whom had to register as students, register as continuing ed students and pay a fee. And then the other 30%, at 40% were the regular academic students. And my audition was tougher for the community people than it was for the students, because I wanted them to lead the students and be the mentors. Mm-hmm. I would like to have had a chamber singer group, for instance, and was getting quite close to that, but just the number of slots for courses and so on, and it just wasn't working. And so I was smelling salt water on the coast of Maine daily, and my wife Carol and I were dreaming maybe of living on the coast of Maine, and so the time was right. Anyway. So.
A couple more questions. What would you change about music education, arts education in general, if you could change one big thing?
Ooh. Change it. Well, certainly its importance in curriculum is something that I feel is so important, and I feel that due to monetary constraints, the lack of importance of fine arts in curriculum is probably is a tragedy. We don't realize, and I'm using all fine arts, not necessarily music education, but the importance of fine arts to society, to culture, to learning, to the development of the brain, to the development of maturity and to personality, to the development of tolerance for other people and knowing how the world works and so on. It's just an essential component. And too often when school systems have monetary constraints, the first things to go are the fine arts. It's considered frill. And we ought to know better. I mean, going back to the Greek culture, music was considered an essential element of education. And because of its mathematical mirroring of the world and its systems, to its creative process, to the effect that it has on emotions. It's just, as you talk about music, it's just an astounding art form. And so anyway, if I were to change anything that somehow, and I think that's been my purpose in life through community college education, is to show how important music and its history and its performance is to culture. And to that end, I hope it had some effect of.
And what do you still want to accomplish?
Oh, well, here in Maine, I'm involved in the Mid-Coast Senior College, so I'm teaching a great deal and accomplishing, just keeping my foot in the door, teaching with that wonderful organization, which is a OSHA lifelong learning program. And to that end, exploring lots and lots of new areas through teaching subjects I've not, or in areas of music that I've not taught before. I can go in and teach music of the sea easily, but to take on a course on medieval music and Hildegard von Bingen and do it intelligently and in depth is another whole thing. So I'm reading, I've got 4 books I'm going through right now on music of the Middle Ages, and you'll probably notice there's a book on Hildegard von Bingen, and there are also women's troubadour songs over there, which I didn't even know women sang troubadour songs. And so anyway, that's been wonderful. The other thing is just my personal interest in writing music and continuing that. And I've written quite a bit since I've come up here. It's a hobby, but it's a good discipline. I try and sit down at the piano every morning at 8 o'clock sharp. And from 8 to about 9:30, when I then call my father, who was 100 years old. He lives down the road. So we'll have our little check-in in the morning. And so I'll spend an hour, and then I sometimes go back to it if I'm on a roll. If I've got something percolating, I'll have to get back to it. But
and things non-musical? Would you like to talk about non-musical things?
A lot of my friends are not critical, but almost amused at the number of other things that I have in the way of hobbies. I restore old antique cars. I've got 2 in the garage that I'm putting together now, and I love to get my hands in grease and dirt and motors and carburetors and fuel pumps and whatever I can figure out how those mechanisms work. I've always had a lifelong love of sailing and maritime history, and the family, going back generations, the Gillespie family, have always had boats in the family. My grandfather was a great sailor. He was a Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, had a very handsome power boat in the 1920s and 30s. And my parents, my father and mother, always had a family boat that we could go off camping on, if you will. It's a kind of floating camper. And so we do too. We have a modest little overnighter where we can sleep and cook and sail around the islands of Casco Bay. And so sailing is a strong part of it. And then keeping our house going. And my wife is wonderful at gardening. Carol is a great gardener, so I get to be her handy person by taking the wheelbarrows of dung and dirt to her aid. But,
and one last question, how would you like others to remember you?
I think one of the things is I'd like to be remembered as the creator and developer of one of the best and maybe the most comprehensive community college fine arts programs in the East, and I think we succeeded. I mean, I think we really had. I didn't do it alone. I had, of course, a wonderful support from the dean, who was a really interested in fine arts. And I should mention this. His philosophy was, and I agree with this, is that fine arts and music is the litmus test of the quality of any educational program. And if you don't have, that's how you show it off. If you go and you are looking at a school or a college and they have a really fine, well-disciplined, well-trained choral group or an orchestra or an art department, you know the rest of the school is that way. It follows suit. So he was much more interested in having fine arts as a way of showing off the quality of the institution than, for instance, athletics. And in fact, he became known throughout the state as the dean who closed athletics at Naugatuck Valley. He just didn't think they were anything that valuable. So that would be one thing I'd like to be remembered as. I guess I'd like to be remembered as a historian and as a shanty singer at Mystic Seaport. And I still do shanty programs down and around the state of Maine. I get asked to do programs for historical societies and one thing or another, and I do them. And then as remembered as a choral director and composer. Modest composer, not particularly renowned, but I just love the art form, and I love choral directing. And I don't do that today. I miss that a lot. But maybe that time will come when the time is right.
And you will be remembered as a great mentor.
Good. Well, I'd like to think that I had a little influence on a few people.
To many people.
That's wonderful.
Thank you, Stuart.
You're welcome, Nanette.